last week we talked about bias. The last 2 weeks we've talked about bias and how AI has lots of different pieces that show many different bias points and different biases based on lots of different information. We had a lively discussion last week. So to build on that, we said, well, let's talk about ethics and the fun of ethics in AI, which I think we all have run into some interesting, we'll just call them interesting things with AI and how can be ethical and how it can be rather unethical. And the use of AI, is it ethical or is it unethical? I know yesterday in a conversation, I was chatting with a faculty member about how you can leverage some of the tools and how you can, take some of the material, put it in ChatGPT, create summaries, you can change the format of the material. And the one thing she asked me, she's like, is that plagiarism? Is that ethical? And I was like, oh, that's a great question. You should come today so we could talk about it. So, but she had an 8 o'clock appointment, so she couldn't make it. But in thinking about that, what are your thoughts? What are you thinking about this? I know that we all have and for some of us, we have some strong thoughts on it, but I want to open the floor to see what you guys are thinking, and then we can kind of weigh in and talk about that. What does that look like to you? What does ethics in AI look like? Or what are you worried about? And if no one unmutes, I will keep talking because, we all have that gift of gab where we can go for, hours on end. And this is one of my favorite subjects. I mean, if you think about the plagiarism side, I think we've heard that over and over and over again. Students are using it's plagiarism. We must catch them. And I think recently in one of my courses, I feel like we're playing gotcha. And I'm like, we're not going to play that game, guys. We're going to assume that everyone is using it. But how are they using it? Is it their writing partner? Is it something they're working with? So Sherman, go ahead and weigh on in this conversation.
Yeah, I mean, like I'm seeing this sort of a repeat of the academic panic at the start of the internet,
Hmm.
uh, and I guess the way that there are sort of two things. First of all, unlike in the 1990s, we really don't have tools to worry about. And by the way, I don't think I wouldn't call it plagiarism because how can you steal from a simulated discourse? Um, I have other concerns about that. And I'm in the same way that I remember the discussion. We had a Center for Teaching and Learning at my where I was at the time. The head of it said, "Well, you should be creative enough in designing assessments that should be hard to plagiarize." It's a little bit tougher now, although in my experience from more than 30 years, most students, I suppose there's a very small slice of students who decide at the beginning of a semester they want to get a good grade with the minimum effort possible. Really hard to do something about that. But most of my experience with students cheating are people who get behind and panic. And if you design a set of assessments and activities that are linked and require, things to feed into each other, it's really hard at the last minute, the second to last day of class, to generate all of that. My concerns are far more sort of pedagogical in terms of those issues. But I just sort of, I guess what maybe as an historian, I'm like going, what are the things that echo similar panics in the past? And a lot of it is around oh my gosh, we must focus on enforcement as opposed to, well, enforcement can't come until you do a lot of education and teaching first.
Definitely agree with that. Other thoughts?
I think I just want to emphasize one thing that Sherman said there is I think and I think you really nailed it really well, is that if you focus on the process versus the product, then you have many opportunities along the way for either formative assessment or check-ins, and that avoids that whole notion of everything coming due at one time. So I was just with some teachers yesterday, and they were having that same discussion. They said that if we don't just have that one end paper and we do a lot of different steps along the way, it helps alleviate that a lot. So I appreciate that.
What we've done in the learning design program is we make them use it on our terms instead of just saying, here's an assignment, write something, and then knowing that they're going to go to ChatGPT and come up with something. The assignments are structured to include AI, so they have to follow the framework that we've laid out for them. And in terms of what Sherman was saying, one analogy that just leapt to mind, as Sherman said, can you plagiarize from a simulated situation, is, something that just came into my head for whatever reason was it's analogous to homeopathy, where they keep diluting it and diluting it and diluting it. And that, yes, those simulated conversations are coming from, a source document somewhere. But as they continue to bring in more and as you continue to mix and remix, and it just keeps diluting it down. So is it plagiarism? I personally wouldn't call it plagiarism, but it's a remix, and I think we should look to some of the work that Lawrence Lessing has done on that and talked about, the remix.
So I'm going to push back. I do think it's plagiarism in the technical sense of that if you take something written by ChatGPT or another human and put your name to it, I think that's plagiarism. But if you take something that ChatGPT has written and you work on it and you make it your own and you can stand behind every word that's in there so that tomorrow you cannot, if you are told that what's this argument that you're making, that you can stand behind every word in it, then I think it's okay. But if just taking something that GPT wrote and put your name on it, to me is equivalent to taking something that somebody else wrote and put your name on it. So technically, yes, I would say.
It's not even June, so how can you be June or Mishra? So
that's anyway. So there are all these J's that I hang out with, so I wanted to feel with them. So Jim and Jennifer and Janelle. So I decided to change my name today. So that's all.
I feel
okay. So if they take what ChatGPT has written and then go edit heavily, is that plagiarism?
I think if they edit it and they can stand behind whatever they have written, that every word in it, that they can't use, let's say you say, oh, why did you make this argument? And they can't stand behind it. They can say, oh, if they use the excuse that, oh, GPT wrote it, so I'm not responsible for it. That's a problem, right? And so you have to be able to stand behind the argument that you're making is where I have sort of kind of drawn the line for myself.
I'm with Sherman that I think the more important question to ask, and that probably wasn't worded correctly, I think that is an important question. But if we're creating assignments that can be completed by ChatGPT, then maybe that's our chance to redesign for more authentic learning experiences, because that's the real problem. So I think it gives us a chance to pause and make sure we're asking the right questions of our students and providing the most authentic opportunities, because those can be, they can have a simulated thought partner, but only as a thought partner if we're really asking them to engage with materials and create things. So I resonated with Sherman's first response about rethinking what we're asking of our students.
I think that's an important point. If we're rethinking what we're asking them to do, if we're using the tools, kind of like Steve mentioned, leveraging them to push them a little bit further. But then, as Punya mentioned, looking at, can you stand behind what you've done? Have you done what you're supposed to? So I think if we're looking at it in terms of not plagiarism and playing gotcha, but how do we use these tools to motivate students? Because I think a lot of times they grab the first thing they can find and they, write something really quick and they're done, or they read a little bit to where they can answer questions. I think the nice thing with this is they're not starting with a blank page anymore. Now they can take kind of what we've given them, take a prompt that we've helped them kind of put together, and now kind of scaffold what we've said and go the next step, but not start with that blank piece. I think many of our students struggle with, what am I supposed to do? And I was met with a student yesterday and he works 12-hour days and he does that 6 days a week. So on day 7, he does his homework. And I'm like, where does sleep come in and all the other stuff you need to do? He's like, oh, I just try to get things done. And looking at his assignments, you can tell they're rushed and they're hurried. So it's like, are you thinking about other tools? Are you planning this out? Can you structure things a little bit differently? And I think if we can leverage some of that, we can help students really do something that's impactful, but not take up a ton of time. They can actually figure out, go further using the tools and do it a little bit faster with using them as well.
Jill, this might be a little bit off topic. I'm doing a project creating some learning modules for ADE for foreign nationals to help bridge the culture into our Arizona classrooms. And they sent us the generative AI statement for us as designers. And I thought it was interesting. Can I share it in the chat?
Sure, please do.
It felt really punitive to me, the way I read it. And I feel like it's a little bit of a shame. I feel a little bit restricted, and I don't want our students to feel that.
So, couple things just to kind of frame my perspective here. I don't believe using generative AI in appropriate ways, in beneficial ways, is, infringement of copyright laws or plagiarism, because the student needs to put their own name on their assignment. They need to do so knowing that the content in that assignment they agree with. Okay, like that's the bottom line. You're putting forth this assignment to me with your name on it, so you need to be the one that I go to if something's not quite right in the assignment. So there's that. The other thing that I know, and this goes along with Steve's comment, is that if we don't design activities with generative AI embedded into them in ways that we feel are appropriate and helpful, beneficial to students, then students will do it on their own. And they come up with crap, right? Like they come up with C-level work, B- at best. And you can tell, but you can't nail them on it. So what I'm thinking about for the summer course I'm teaching is how to prepare a statement on template. I give students like a template that's already APA formatted. So maybe a part of that template on the cover page is, not punitive, Melissa, like what you're talking about, but even if I prescribe how they used ChatGPT or another tool, I want them to state in that paper upon submission, this is how I partnered with generative AI tools and, sign it. And it's still my content. I'm still going to be held accountable for what I'm putting forth. So I don't know what that language looks like yet, but that's kind of what I'm playing with in my head right now. So thought I'd kind of throw it out there and see if some of you might be good sounding boards.
So I had a similar thing in my class last year where I said that I expect you to be using these, but standard academic integrity rules apply, which is that you will not pass off work done by somebody else, whether human or machine, as your own. And then you will be transparent in your use of it. So you will not be penalized for using it, but you cannot just take what it generated and say and claim that you wrote it. So you have to say, oh, this was generated by ChatGPT or Claude or whoever, and this is my response to it, and this is how I plan to use it or think about it.
And even beyond that, Punya, I'd kind of see a statement where they said, I used ChatGPT to do this, and it provided me this benefit, like even like a little table of here are all the tools I leveraged in the process of creating this assignment. So they could just report out to me that that the complete transparency is a perfect way to put it without penalizing them, right? Like I want to see them report the value added nature and really think about it and not feel like they're trying to slide one over on me.
I love that. And then with the last sentence, and something I would do different in the future is.
I like Rachel's comment that she put into chat, thinking about Google search and using Google, thinking about we didn't ask them to do a lot based on those. And now we're asking them to do a lot based on the use of some of these GPT tools. And I think it goes back to what Sherman said initially when the internet came in, I don't remember exactly like all the stuff around that one, but thinking about just, I remember when some of the word processing tools and spell check and all those. So how does that change, what do we do differently? I know in one of my courses, and I just slacked Kyle and said we need Punya's integrity statement for EDT 180 because we want them to sign that so that they know we're not going to penalize you. We just want to know what you're up to. And we want to see the first run so that way you're not turning in something you can't stand behind.
So I just wanted to comment. I've been kind of posting in the chat. Thank you, everybody, for sharing. Yeah, I heard that student argument about the Google search, and it was a tough one to handle because I never asked about what sites they Google searched in the past. I mean, it was a valid sort of just random response comment, and I thought that's genuine, that's authentic, and it's a valid issue that we should probably pay some critical attention to. But I recently sat with someone from the Bar Association who's a former colleague, friend of mine for 20 years. And it's this issue for the bar. They're dealing with this intellectual property and AI. It's hit the courts. They've been dealing with it. They have a task force, similar with what we're doing in terms of education and how we're dealing with this. So I think the intellectual property movement in the last two cases that I posted in the chat are really interesting. And I say that because I had Copilot produce an original poem for me the other day, and it was the strangest thing. And I thought this is being passed off as artistic, creative, higher order work. And it wasn't bad. I just wanted to it was a haiku. It was written in proper form, and it was tough to grade. And so as an artist, I think there is a creative freedom that's almost debilitating in terms of its intimidation. And I recently used Getty images in an academic presentation because they're so academic friendly. We're not profiting on it. Getty images is one we revert to. And here they are in a 2023 case about an AI generative. And this is about text to image art. So again, that artist, creative, intellectual property. And I see those two recent current cases. I'm hearing it with the Bar Association and how they're dealing with this concept of intellectual property. And then, of course, Harvard beat us to the publication last week. I mean, so that seems to be where I'm focused at what we're doing with the back end in terms of how we're holding on to that creative intelligence we see with artists and other original higher order writing and poetry and what we're doing with that intimidation for those original, innovative, creative thinkers to make sure they're not intimidated by this tool, So that's kind of where I'm at.
Rachel, I dropped a book reference in the chat. He talks about this concept in his book because he says what makes AI bad also makes it good at what you were just talking about.
Thank you very much. This is one that's in my Amazon basket, so I'll make sure I actually click yes on this one. Thank you.
I think I actually reaffirmed I was going to read this because I think Jim, didn't you throw this out on the list?
Yeah, I've read it cover to cover, and it's fabulous.
Yeah, I'm halfway through.
It has some good chapters on using AI as a mentor or assistant as well. Yeah. Too. It's a great read. I'm an Ethan Mollick fanboy.
Yeah, I think in terms of, the ethical use of AI within the college, within the university, it's going to keep changing. It's a very fluid situation, so we have to be ready to adapt and change. We can sit here as academics and say, oh, we're going to catch them, damn it. Well, we're not, because it's going to get good enough that we're not going to be able to distinguish it from what a student might write. There are some who argue that that the best writer is going to beat AI every time, but let's face it, most of our students are mediocre writers at best. So
most of us are average writers. I mean, let's face that fact too, So yeah, I mean, I think the ethical issues, are fraught in this, right? And it's the same thing of if you want to go buy a pair of shoes, do we look at the provenance of those shoes and whose labor was used to make it and market it? So just living in this world means leaving behind a carbon footprint. So we are making choices about these all the time. And I think that in some ways, the Gen AI situation is somewhat similar. So I was just this morning listening to Ezra Klein's thing with the head of, which is actually kind of weirdly scary episode of his show where he's talking to the head of Anthropic. And his argument was there are legal cases against them now for copyright infringement and stealing people's intellectual property. And his response was, we are taking stuff that's on the open internet. I mean, that's his legal stance, right? That's on the open internet, and we are not replicate. I mean, it's not the same as a Google search. Every time you ask a question, it's building it from scratch. So according to them, that is new content. And I can see the value of that argument too. I mean, just like Rachel, you said you created a new poem. That poem had never existed before in this world. So it's not finding a poem in the world and spitting it out to you. It's making it from scratch. You can hit reload, it'll make a slightly different poem. And if you say, oh, take on a persona of a dog and write a haiku from the point of view of a dog about whatever, it will do that. None of that ever exists in the world. So there is a certain newness to this technology, which I think is very different from other technologies that have come in the past, and particularly its generative nature and the fact that we can converse with it, right? That we can go back and forth. You can start tweaking your haiku. You can say, I want a little bit more punch in the last line. I want, alliteration in this. It'll keep doing that. You can now, is the final creation that of AI? Is it a creation that you made, or is it something that was made in collaboration? I think that's the interesting question, really.
It's also, the whole discussion is also a Matryoshka doll, right? Because you take the top on off, you start the discussion with, is this plagiarism? And as you keep, unnesting those dolls, you transit from the ethics of, using the classroom to the ethics of developing AI. So you start with, is this plagiarism? And you end with, well, I integrated it into my course, and now I've just contributed, 89 tons of carbon to the environment because, my students are going to put that much out carbon, doing this assignment. So, it's fraught with twists and turns.
So,
well, Nathan,
go ahead, Jennifer. Sorry.
I was just going to say the other aspect that we kind of get stuck in the middle of here with, especially as higher ed, educators, is the fact of we're trying to keep this, the academic integrity piece and making sure that, students aren't plagiarizing and those sort of things. But then we also have to look at what are they going to be expected to do when they go out into their careers? How are they going to be able to use this? And, to Melissa's point, if the schools are, creating policies that are, kind of punitive around that, they're going to try to shy away from it. And then is that a disservice to them when they get out into their careers? We don't know.
And I know Sherman's going to grimace over this comment, but that's okay. I mean, it really does force the question at some level, is academic integrity in the way we currently think of it viable in today's world? Do we need to rethink how we define that and what it means?
So, Steve, I mean, one of the things I've been thinking about is that how much is this idea of intellectual ownership of ideas and why we do citations and, all of that. It's a function of print technology, right? In an oral culture, you wouldn't be able to do that. You wouldn't be able to pinpoint who originally came up with the idea, And so as we come up with these newer technologies, I think the meanings of these things start shifting as well. So I would sort of agree with you on that. But I think it's a much more long-term thing,
This may be way out there, too futuristic, but I hope we start to think about how to ask students how they're using it. How are they prompting? What are their prompts? I'm thinking about generative AI tools as a professional career tool. Can we begin shaping their higher level use of the tools so that they become more adept and creative and whatnot? Like how can we weave that into our design, into our rubrics, into our feedback, at least in the interim time? Might be interesting to think about that. Silence. Okay, way out there. I get it.
Not totally. We're doing that in EDT 180, and so is Steve. So I think there's but we're tech courses. So I think that's the other thing. It would be great if we can weave it in courses that are not necessarily tech heavy or tech focused. But I know in Ed Studies, that is our charge for this summer. We're looking at what is the program's view of Ed Studies and how will it be embraced in all the courses. So I think it'll be interesting to look at and working with faculty to say, what are you thinking? Where do you see your assignments? Having them run their assignments through, can AI complete my assignment? And what do you do from there?
I had a very interesting experience. I have a local coffee shop that I go to in the morning, and like most coffee shops, there's a community table there. So I sat down and a family sat down at the table with me, and I jokingly said something like, the reason I've called this meeting, and they laughed. And I don't remember how we got there, but at some point they said, well, we're instructional designers, so we can get that course together for you. And I said, oh, I said, what fortuitous happenstance. I happen to be the program coordinator for that program at ASU. And we began talking, we got to talking about generative AI. These two folks were instructional designers for the state. They work in some state agency, and they said, oh yeah, we're banned from AI. We're not allowed to touch it. And I said, what an interesting thing. And then like 2 days later, I think I mentioned this already, a couple of days later, I was with one of my I don't know, let's call him a coffee buddy at Lux, and he's a computer science teaching professor. I said, I'm just curious, Jim, what are you guys doing, with AI? He said, nothing. I said, what? You're computer science. How can you be doing nothing with AI? He said, well, the old guard doesn't like it, so we're banned from talking about it. I'm like, that's crazy to me, crazy in a computer science program. So, the feelings on where we are and what's going to happen with it, are all over the map. But, there's no avoiding the reality that this is going to be, I mean, if you look at nothing other than the tools, Copilot, Word, Photoshop, go down the list of tools, AI has already been incorporated into most of the tools I use. So to try to think that this is not going to be a co-design or a co-partner or a co-intelligence, whatever, throughout your work life, throughout your professional practice is insane. So that's why we took the perspective we did in LDT, because right out of the gate in November of 22, a couple of thought leaders in the industry were saying, this is our lot in life. This is our design partner now. So we may as well get used to it.
And Teresa, getting to what you mentioned a few minutes ago, this is something that's been on my mind for quite a while now. And with the way that you described, asking these questions, it gets at, and Janelle mentioned this a few minutes ago, the redesign that we're going to be doing with ED2 180 is going to be dealing a lot with data. And, a big question has come up around, what constitutes good data. So in order for us to, get at that, we need to start asking exactly the kinds of questions that you're talking about, because I think that if we don't use, the questions that you're asking as kind of an opportunity to get at that and to have the students start thinking about things that they're getting from these generative AI tools in that way, I think it's a majorly missed opportunity and very dangerous.
And maybe it's time, Kyle, to start thinking of a limited segment or some assignments as an iterative process where we get to see how they're working through it at every stage of the assignment.
I absolutely agree. I think it's a great opportunity. I think it would be unfortunate if we missed the opportunity to start having them ask those questions, because we're starting to introduce things like media literacy into K-12 space, but there's a lot of folks that are coming into college courses at any level of their life stages, and there's no guarantee that they've come across these things. So it's an opportunity to not necessarily go in depth about things like media literacy, but we can at least start to ask them these questions to get them thinking about it in those terms, because kind of like Steve was saying, there's no getting around it. It's already pretty much ubiquitous. So how can we make sure that people are able to use these tools in ways that are responsible?
And the other kind of, I don't know, part of getting students to use it on our terms is that, while, as Kyle says, the technology itself is ubiquitous, based on the responses that we saw when we were at Folk Fest and the other conferences, and we asked these questions, there's still probably Jen, you can nod or disagree, but there's still probably 60% of the audience that we deal with, our students, etc., that are terrified of this stuff and don't know how to use it.
Well, and we're finding that they're not, I mean,
Right?
not only terrified, but they're trying to figure it out. There's still very much in that. I mean, this technology is very much following the, normal technology adoption, curves, but it's an accelerated rate. And there are some people who are still in that, that end group that are trying to figure out even what this is.
Yeah, and I'm going to argue that the term of that curve is so compressed and the peak is so high that if there are some people who don't make it over that peak and get to the other side, that's it. There will be no laggards in this, in this case. There'll just be disenfranchised people.
I think in that chat, Kim brought up an interesting point of view of thinking differently, using these tools and leveraging them. I think that's one of the things that, and to kind of emphasize Steve's point, what happens to those people that don't jump on board, that they're not, when they become disenfranchised, what does that look like? As other people are now thinking completely different, leveraging the tools and pushing new bounds with the tools because they're using them as a thought partner or different ways of designing or doing their jobs. Do people get left? How far do they get left behind, and what happens in that instance?
I think the pricing models of these LLMs is also a huge issue in terms of equity and the digital divide, where some of us are using 4.0 and you've got Claude and Gemini, and they all have 2 or 3 different versions of them that are different capabilities. And so what happens when GPT-5 comes out and you still have people using GPT 3.5? Now you've got an enormous gap of knowledge. So not only is it just, are you using it or not, but which version of it are you using? So I think we're going to see an increasingly wider gap as every version costs, $20. Even Copilot, I think, is what, $30 a month per user.
My AI is better than yours.
Oh, stop it, Steve.
You mentioned a really great point, though. I put it jokingly in the chat, right? A new Nintendo every year. I mean, that was my childhood. That was the accelerated rate of a new model, a new iPhone. You're right. There is a concern we need to take in terms of who's going to be able to keep up with the Joneses, so to speak, with this technology. It's very fast moving, but I do think technology in general has been fast moving in terms of what becomes obsolete. I mentioned AOL, I mentioned dial-up, I mentioned coax cable. These things faded out fairly fast and had a great economic upheaval on the companies that were dependent on them. I mean, so I do see that there's going to be some of those transitions. I worry a little bit about those who feel disinhibited of the original innovative creative work. Like right now, that seems to be, I don't want to take my creative thinkers, I don't want to sweep the rug out from underneath their feet and make them feel like what they do or what they can do has no value anymore in our society, whether it's economic based or some other means of having purpose. And that to me seems to be more of my concern about this intellectual pushback with the creative kind of thinkers that are feeling very disinhibited by the technology and the fast pace that it's changing at.
I mean, in terms of pricing, it's still fundamentally based on the crack model. Here's a little taste. Here's 3.5, fess up your $20 every month for a good hit. But, I'm in a situation now where I have a niece who went to Sarah Lawrence to get a graduate degree in, creative writing. And she thinks in her head, she's an amazing writing. I read her writing. At best, she's mediocre. And the writing she does is exactly what ChatGPT is going to replace people at. So now, she's out of work because the publication she was working for, I suspect, based on what's being posted, started using ChatGPT. So yeah, there's going to be, job losses. There's going to be problems in that kind of area too. Another ethical question. And there's a quote. I don't know where the quote comes from. It's like, will AI take my job? No, the person who knows how to use AI will take your job. So, that's another ethical question we're facing is how do we pattern our students, get our students and prepare them for success using these tools. Back to my original point that we, instead of saying, oh, we're going to catch you and we're going to ban you, it needs to be purposefully engineered to what we're doing. Although I know Punya doesn't necessarily agree with that. Or excuse me, Junya.
Yeah, I think I don't know where I stand with respect to that. I think we overestimate the impact of technology in the short term, and we underestimate how it shifts things from under our feet in ways that we don't anticipate in the long term. So one of the things that I've been trying to sort of make the case for is that if you look at there are all these quotes that edtech people throw about that I used to throw about, like, Edison saying that the film is going to transform education and whatever, right? And it didn't. And we're like, technology doesn't change things. The schools are still the same. But the thing is that film did change the world around it, right? The world around schools. So if you think about the rise of radio and film, they're deeply connected to the rise of, let's say, fascism and other ideas that could be spread widely, or the movement to decolonize the world, and where the ideas of freedom and so on could be spread to countries like India. So whether or not the classroom changes, the world around the classroom has changed. So we need to be thinking in those terms. That's how I have sort of started thinking about it. And again, there are complex sort of kinds of things, but so I think I think we need to be giving it a much more long-term view than a short-term view. I think that it will transform society in ways. It's like social media. If I go back to 2007, Punya, you can go to my website and you will find examples of, how can I use Twitter to have a parallel discussion in my doctoral seminar? I'm not thinking that these social media could transform democracy, could lead to people dying in Myanmar and to escalation of a racial conflict or other conflict in India, and to the kind of mental health issues that our youth are facing today, and so I've sort of started thinking more of what is this going to mean? This is a technology that will be incredibly persuasive. It can form one-on-one relationships with you, and there will be companies which will seek to take advantage of that, Replica.ai or whatever. What does that mean for the long term? And when we talk, Kyle, I think, mentioned media literacy, and I think I've been thinking a lot about sort of media literacy, and I think that we've been asking the wrong question about media literacy. The questions have been about media. The questions really should be about our cognitive biases, that what is it in that media that is so social media is tapping into our cognitive biases for reputation and to be acknowledged and known and popular and status. What is AI going to tap into? There's a whole mess of questions in there, to be honest. But I think that that's one thing that we in academia should really be thinking about. That's the privilege we have to think more long term, to think deeper. And I think that's the kind of conversation we should part of the conversation. Yes, we have to deal with the immediate here now for sure. But I think there's a longer term thing that we need to be preparing ourselves and our students for. And it goes beyond sort of the economics of jobs to the kinds of worlds that we want to live in, the society that we want to live in, or that we will be living in, or whatever it may be.
We need add this to my list button for these questions, just like we have on Amazon.
No, it is something I've been really pondering about, because I don't want the same mistakes that I made with social, like the short-sightedness that I showed back then. I want to be a little wiser than I was, back in 2007, 8, 9, or whatever it was, with the Arab Spring and this democratization of knowledge, and it's the new Gutenberg revolution, and anybody can be a publisher. And yes, that is all true, and wonderful things have come from it. My career is built on the fact that the internet happened to be arising when I was sort of growing as a scholar, right? So totally get that. But there is also a flip side to it, which I was not sensitive to. And I think, like, right now, that's my job, is to ring the warning bell and say we need to be thinking about those things.
So Punya, the way that I think about this and the way that I kind of frame it is the kinds of things that you're talking about are the foundational elements. Now, various different types of technologies have been with us for thousands of years. This is obviously a little bit different in some respects, but the technology curve is obviously not linear. But we have the opportunity with a tool like this to create kind of a foundation. I think that's really what the kinds of things that you're focused on are about, is creating that foundation for the individual to use these tools in ways that are going to genuinely help them, not get them swept up into like a political rabbit hole or something else like that, where they're not sure what's true or false, and can start to use the tools more responsibly and in a way that's genuinely going to be empowering for them. And in that respect, it's similar to the technologies that we've had in the past. It's just, this is more of a, whereas I think of a lot of the other tech tools that we've had before as being more physical, this is more cognitive. So that's kind of how I think about it, is like, let's take this opportunity to set that foundation for the individual. And then from there, hopefully, they'll be able to use these things more responsibly.
I think it's also important to remember too that the embrace of these technologies is universal, and there are still plenty of people who are going to push back and say, nope, this is the way it's always been done. This is the way it should be done. You're wrong. And, so then there's a broader ethical question about how do you negotiate working with those kinds of folks in the academy, because I'm sure we all know some old school, ivy covered walls perspective kind of folks who are like, that's a sin to use that kind of technology in your writing.
We have about 11 minutes before our time runs out today. And it's been a lively discussion. I don't know if we want to continue with this discussion or if we want to talk about AI as an assistant or a companion, or however we're phrasing it, your friend.
Yes, let's talk about my friend Eliza.
Steve, I'm not sure if you're being snarky this morning or if you want to have a friend Eliza.
That one was completely for Junior.
Okay.
This is Steve being Steve, which is what we all
Right?
have.
Did you make a really good point, because I got the poem when I personalized my prompt as if Copilot were my friend. I just needed to talk sort of under my breath about something I was experiencing to process it in a cognitively healthy way. And lo and behold, because I personalized my interaction, I had a much more personalized original poem created. And it was really fascinating. So I think there's a lot to be said about the use of personal assistants. I'm very apprehensive about the use of teacher assistants, maybe because I do think that is one of the ways we become teachers ourselves. Like, what if we take away that avenue for our educational prep program? I'm just not sure that I want to see that integration, but that's more of that taking the rug out from underneath people concern that I've already talked about. But I think that personal assistance, in terms of how I've used it, I will tell you that Copilot helped me replace my garbage disposal, and I saved about $500. So personal assistant, that's the stuff I need help with, not my original work that I'm writing a story for one of my classes, right? Like, help me replace my garbage disposal.
There's also there's a component here of time value, right? What's the value of my time? I can sit here while I'm working on this project for enterprise technology, this UDL project, and I can sit here for 40 minutes, 50 minutes, an hour, and write the code to just make this little URL embedder. Or I can just take 2 seconds and let ChatGPT do it for me, and then use that 50 minutes for something else. So, it's not only about it being an assistant, cognitively, intellectually, but also about the value of your time.
I think that's true. But one of the other things that I'm wondering, and this is really where I think one of our challenges with education is the perspective that a lot of people have, and it sounds like even some of our students have, is that when it comes down to these assignments, it's a task to be done, not necessarily something that's going to help them advocate for themselves more effectively. And I think that that's a perceptual problem, and maybe an opportunity for us to frame things a little bit differently. But obviously we're fighting against a lot of economic and cultural forces in that respect.
Well, my response to that would be, that's part of, engineering it to be used purposefully.
Right.
And then, on terms of like the teacher prep side, my guess is that while there are many districts that are pushing back on this right now and saying, AI is banned, you're not allowed to use it. My guess is that eventually their, legal departments will get involved, and yes, you'll be able to use it, but you must use this prompt that was created at the district level.
It'll take a while for those for districts and things like that to come around to that too. I mean, that's, you figure even when I was a technology teacher in 2015, they were still, YouTube was absolutely still banned. Things like even TED Ed was something that we had to get permission for because it was a video-based platform that was outside of, something on the school, server. So those are, they take a little while to get into things, especially into the lower grade levels, for sure.
Arizona, where we aspire for 21st century skills, but live in the 18th century. Sorry.
I don't feel like it's a flex to say 21st century skills when it's 2024. That's like a quarter away in.
That's actually my hot point, Melissa. When they start talking about that at the district, I'm like, you do realize we're a quarter of the way through and that it's not happening 50 years in the future.
It's like my cutting edge 1990s sweatshirt.
Yeah.
I
cut on off.
That's okay. I had a question. It's a little bit, it connects to ethics, or maybe it's just best practices, but I just noticed recently a number of times where, the AI otter pops into a meeting, and even like when I, called in to do a meeting one-on-one, it just shows up. And I guess I was curious to get a sense of what you all feel about that, because I come from the frame of mind of that. If you're going to be recording somebody like that, it should be very well stated at the beginning, and people should be fully aware of that. I think people can present themselves in different ways when they know they're being recorded. And, I'm just curious, what your thoughts are about that, if you all have any preferences.
So, Anna, Betty and I had sort of looked into this last year when orders started popping up in different meetings to look at ASU's policy. And ASU's policy in this is that if these are sort of, formal meetings of, Betty, what was the exact language? But like open meetings, you can use order on, but we couldn't use it. We were not allowed to use it for, let's say, if it's like a faculty promotion and tenure committee meeting or some formal official work, you're not allowed to use that because that data would potentially be used to train these AI models. And so we, so public meetings that anybody can drop in, yes, those you are entitled to use. So we have had Otter being used a couple of times in our Just an Hour series, for instance, and that's okay because those are open meetings, right? So there are some, you're absolutely right. There are some guidelines that we need. Betty, I don't know if I'm mangling up, I think, what we had sort of discussed.
No, yeah, the concern is legally if confidential information, personnel information gets into a broader database, it would violate all sorts of FERPA rules and things like that. So yeah, now that may change since ASU now has its own AI internal system, but so far we haven't received any different guidance. So yeah, that's an important point.
Yeah, I was just curious because I think it's happened in a number of cases without any kind of prior discussion amongst other staff and such. So maybe we need to more clearly address that on our rules.
So I use the Zoom's summary tool, which is kind of a similar version, does something similar to Otter AI, but it comes at a, also I use it because it comes at it from another legal perspective, which is ADA compliance. Right. I have deaf students in my course and they need those summaries and transcripts.
From a ASU security review standpoint, the Zoom one has been approved by ASU, went through this full security review. There, to my knowledge, and that always changes, because they're looking at them all the time. But to my knowledge, as of right now, there are no others of these, meeting summary tools like Otter AI or anything like that that have passed the ASU security review. So Zoom is the only one that has done that, and that took them close to 6 months to get through the full security review because of the amount of changes that needed to happen to make that work.
So any last thoughts? We have about 2 minutes before our time. I will say thank you to everybody. This has been a lively conversation. I guess we'll delve more into the AI assistant or companion a bit more, and maybe we'll start with that next time and then round off on ethics. I think when we first started thinking about ethics, it was, what's out there, what are people thinking? So thank you for your thoughts and your opinions, and please, come back next Tuesday. We can talk about it some more. And for those of you that did not, unmute or talk, please, chime in, tell us your thoughts and your feelings. We really want to, if everyone contributes, we learn from everyone. So please contribute and share and ask questions if you have questions as well. So if there's any other final thoughts, please feel free to share. If not, have a great week, and we will see you back next week at 4 p.m.